cooked up both of them. I think that, 9/11, I think, was exactly what we know it was. So I don't think it's worth...
But that caller also said that, in his view, President Bush has created a new generation of militants.
Sure, yes. I mean, it clearly has. As I said, Iraqis were pretty pleased to see the back of Saddam Hussein. If the U.S. had then said, we're handing over to the UN, or just gone home, there wouldn't have been this tremendous resentment. As I said, Iraq is very complicated, but, it's very simple. Nobody likes occupiers. The Americans didn't like the British ruling them. Who does? Like a foreign power. So then people like al-Qaeda and the others were able to feed off this resentment. The Iraqis weren't, they were religious before, but they weren't, you never had this sort of mass slaughter that al-Qaeda brought to Iraq. And this was the doing of the Iraq War. Saddam Hussein, people like the leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq, which is somewhat different from the Osama bin Laden's organization, Zarqawi, that, it's been well established by U.S. intelligence that Saddam's security was looking for him to arrest him in 2003. So he wasn't their guy. He was somebody they were rather frightened of. And so were the other al-Qaeda operatives. They did have one little base in northern Iraq, but it was in Kurdistan, in the one area of Iraq that Saddam didn't control. So it's a complete mystification to ever say that there was any link between or alliance between Saddam and al-Qaeda.
That caller also asked if this is a fair representation of what Muqtada al-Sadr looks like.
Yeah, I mean, he has this intimidating appearance.
Short, tall?
Short, stocky.
Born 1973.
Yeah, young. I think he inherited a movement built up by his father at a very young age. He wants to look older and he wants to look serious. You don't see him smile too often. His father used to smile a lot, had a long white beard. He was called his nickname was the White Lion. And this religion, most of the leaders are very old. So he wants to look serious. You always see him pictured on posters with his father, martyrs, his father and his grandfather, both martyrs. A guy who in private, people who were close to him said you can sit beside him for as his advisor for a couple of years, still not know what's going on inside his head. Very suspicious, but with good reason for suspicions. I mean, this is a guy who's only just alive. All his male relatives have been killed, some of them in horrible circumstances. A guy who often wears the martyr's shroud because he feels he might be killed at any moment. And often that is true. But I think, the journalistic cliches were the renegade cleric. But why renegade? He hadn't changed sides at any moment. He was always against Saddam. He was against the occupation. Firebrand cleric. That doesn't mean much, except the crowds shout your name. But in fact, very experienced politically in the 90s. Political operative for his father. Knew everything about the street politics of Iraq. Ran a magazine. Then, when his father was killed, he was advised, you're on the edge of death. Stay at home. Don't give Saddam any excuse to kill you. He was under house arrest. Then, after the fall of Saddam, still very dangerous for him. But he was somebody who's never very cautious, never likes to be blocked into a corner. He was, in 2004, there was two big sieges of Najaf by the U.S. Marines. He was always looking for a way out, never wanted to get boxed in. And has always been keen to keep his political support, almost more than his military support. I think if he loses some military support, it doesn't matter too much, but politically, he must remain strong. So an intelligent man, a very experienced politician, I think very different from the sort of media image that he has outside Iraq.
Next call for Patrick Cockburn comes from Fort Myers, Florida Independent. Thanks for holding. You're on the air.
Yes, good morning, and thank you for C-SPAN. Thank you for your reporting, sir. My question has to do with a show I saw on 60 Minutes concerning the government over there in Iraq, and they're missing $18.5 billion. And the show dealt with the fact that the equivalent of the chief budget officer, the man who was in charge of, where the money goes, was hounded out of Iraq because he was honest. And so there's 18.5 billion, missing that they can't account for. And what I understand, Iraq is taking in $6 billion a month in oil revenues. Do the people of Iraq have any idea how they're being ripped off by this government and this group of leaders, or is everything just blamed on America? That's my real question. Who's getting all this money? Is Muqtada, is he getting the money too?
Thank you, caller.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, but the Iraqis talk about this the whole time, because one of the amazing things about Iraq is that, you see streets with raw sewage in them. Half the time it's getting really hot in Baghdad at this moment, and there isn't enough electricity to run the air conditioning. So they say, where is all this money? What's happening to it? Now, an awful lot of it has just simply been stolen. I mean, I know one former Iraqi minister who, in London in the 1990s, if you saw him, he tried to borrow £100 off you. These days, he's built a house elsewhere in the Middle East. It has 3 swimming pools, 2 outside, 1 inside. Yeah, he used to be a minister, not for very long, but a lot of all the money went missing. Now, there are, you have a degree of corruption in Iraq, which is different. Some places you have corruption, people take 15%, 25%. But in Iraq, it's often 100%. A few years ago, the entire military procurement budget went, $1.2 billion. All they got was some scrap metal from Poland, that great military supplier. The investigators, one of the most important, as you just mentioned, has fled to the US. Some of the others have been killed inside the green zone, shot in the head. I've done some corruption stories there, and nobody's ever tried to do anything with me, but people kept on asking me, don't you think it's really dangerous to start asking these questions? Now, Iraqis, it's one of the reasons that's so difficult, and it's a good question, this. Iraqis find it so difficult to identify with the government, is that they know these people have made enormous amounts of money. They know that Iraq has a big oil revenues, and they know they're still living in misery. And the government either won't or can't get the money down to the people. And there's extraordinary levels of corruption that you can't do anything without paying a bribe. Secondly, people often buy positions in the government. They borrow the money, you buy the job, and then you have to get the money back by being bribed yourself. It's kind of ludicrous. It's not too bad for me, but I mean, people who've got money, you can do this. But if you're a poor person trying to get a passport, you can't, often there's only one way to do it, which is to pay some money.
Have you had to pay bribes?
I've had to facilitate my way by looking at the financial interests of people who might help me. In some ways, you just can't avoid doing this. I don't like doing it, but a friend of mine, honest guy, businessman, some time ago, wanted to register his car, wanted to get a new number plate. He went and sat, and he thought, I won't pay anybody. He sat in his car in a queue for 5 hours. The queue didn't move. Eventually, he couldn't stand the heat. He went back to his office, made one telephone call, and they said, sure, yeah, $100 and we'll drop the new number plate round here. The only way of doing it. So for a lot of the government is just a money-making machine for the people who operate it.
Beltsville, Maryland, you're on with Patrick Cockburn.
Yeah, good morning, sir, and thank you for C-SPAN, and you're indeed the voice of the
Caller? Sorry about that. Beltsville hung up. San Diego, good morning.
Yes, I'd like to know, does Muqtada want a partition? What is his ultimate goal that he would like? Oh. Also, I was very surprised to see that the head of Iraq went over to Iran the other week. And maybe you can clarify for us this terrible war that took place about 20 years ago, and 4 million people died. And what is the link